25 years ago, the historian Deborah Lipstadt took on the Holocaust denier David Irving and won with the help of lawyer Anthony Julius.
We're going to be joined by both of them and asking the question, why has Holocaust denial returned?
To sit for 9 weeks, 10 feet from a man who so joyfully exuded anti-Semitism and racism and misogyny and hatred of Jews and contempt for Jews.
We are a week away from the 80th anniversary of one of the most momentous days in history, the defeat of the Nazis and the end of the Second World War. As concentration camps across Europe were liberated by Allied soldiers, the world woke up to the horrors of the Holocaust. The systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jews and several million others by Adolf Hitler's forces.
Yet despite the first-hand testimonies of countless survivors of this truly heinous period in modern history, Holocaust denial is growing in the wake of the October the 7th attacks, fueled by social media and gaming platforms where anti-Semites claim Jews fabricated evidence of their genocide to gain sympathy, extract reparations from Germany, and facilitate the alleged illegal acquisition of Palestinian land to create Israel.
One trial blew apart the claims of the deniers and the anti-Semites, and today we mark its 25th anniversary. David Irving, the historian who had peddled many of the myths, was found to be a Holocaust denier. Today, we're joined in the Daily Tea studio by the two key players in that remarkable event: American historian Deborah Lipstadt and the lawyer Anthony Julius.
What did that seminal ruling mean for the Jewish community? And as we this year mark the 80th anniversary of the liberation of concentration camps like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, why do growing numbers of people still refuse to believe the atrocities that took place there?
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey.
Welcome to the Daily Tea studio, Deborah and Anthony. Great delight to have you.
Thank you very much.
Just before we come to our conversation, let's just have a little bit of background to this landmark, what was called Irving versus Lipstadt, the Holocaust libel case. Last month marked 25 years since the judgment in that case. British historian David Irving sued you, Deborah, after the publication of your book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. You said correctly that, we quote, Irving is one of the most dangerous spokespersons for Holocaust denial. Anthony, you represented Deborah in that libel trial. Some of our audience may remember you as having represented Princess Diana during her divorce from Prince Charles. Today, you are deputy chairman of a law firm, Mishkon de Reya, while Deborah, you are professor of modern Jewish history and Holocaust studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Deborah, just start with you. You're here in the UK and welcome to you. What are the events that you're going to be having here to mark this incredible trial and moment?
We've done a number of media events, a number of podcasts, including this one. But most importantly, tonight there will be a panel at Mishkon de Reya's offices with Anthony Julius, James Lipson, his partner, who was a key member of the two of them, worked together hand in hand. David Hare, who wrote the screenplay for the movie Denial, and Jonathan Freeland from The Guardian, talking about the implications of the trial and its contemporary relevance.
I mean, it was such a landmark trial, and I remember it for two reasons. First of all, because my late stepmother's mother, Ruth, had been a Holocaust survivor. She had survived Auschwitz remarkably. And secondly, because I remember as a young hack watching that extraordinary interview that Jeremy Paxman officiated between you and David Irving. And it was on Newsnight back in the year 2000. And it was the inspiration for many people to become
We were in
journalists.
2 different studios.
You were in 2 different studios, but his command of the battle of words between you, and also his research and the quality of his briefing as a background to what you two were going to argue in court was really quite extraordinary.
Your book, before we get to the trial itself, your 1993 book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. Just tell us about writing that book, why you wrote it, and why David Irving was in it.
I wrote the book. I wasn't particularly interested in Holocaust denial. I thought Holocaust denial was like the historical companion to flat Earth theory. Who would take these people seriously, and why should I spend any time doing it? I was in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University lecturing, and I was talking to quite junior at that point, talking to two senior Holocaust historians, both of whom have now passed away. And they said to me, you should look at this. You should study this. My first book had come out on the American press coverage of the Holocaust. And I said, I laughed. And I said, you take this guy seriously? They said, yes. And then we talked about it, and acknowledging that Holocaust denial is not but a form of anti-Semitism. They pushed me to do it. And I said, okay, I'll spend 2 years working on this, maybe 3 years, writing it. It'll come out. And that'll be end. I'll go back on to other things. But it changed my life. And they were right. It was right to take it seriously.
And there was one particular paragraph. I mean, it's not that many words.
So I think maybe 300. If it's 300 words, that's a lot. It's hard hitting. What I say about David Irving, what I said about David Irving, is that he knows the truth, but he bends it to his preconceived fascist ideas, and that he's an apologist for Hitler. His book, Hitler's War, had come out in which he claimed Hitler didn't know about the Holocaust. And then, of course, a later edition came out where he changes it so that the Holocaust didn't happen. It's certainly hard-hitting. And I wasn't going to have that much in it, but someone said to me, one of the people who read it as an editor, said, you really have to expand this. So I expanded it a little more, and it changed my life.
And Anthony, you then get involved when in 1996... Irving hits back. He claims that Deborah has destroyed his livelihood, unleashed what he described as waves of hatred against him. How familiar were you at that point, Anthony, with David Irving's work and indeed with Deborah's book?
Actually, I bought the book. I bought the book because I had my own independent kind of research interests in anti-Semitism, and I was interested in the question and what Deborah had to say about it. So I knew the book. I knew Deborah's work. Generally, Irving himself, I was kind of dimly aware of. He had a kind of following. I knew of that, but he's larger in his own imagination, I think, than in actual historical and social terms. I think he was always a minority taste. And then he took on Deborah. He had a strategy which was to be very vigilant in defense of his reputation, but then be very reasonable in settling. So he would always complain if there was anything critical of him, but then settle with the target newspapers on reasonable terms. So it was cheap and economic for them to apologize and pay him a small amount of money. And in that way, he racked up victory after victory. And then he took on Deborah, I think fully expecting the same kind of outcome.
He offered, I think, $500 to settle for £500.
Yes.
And against Penguin Books as well, who are the publishers
Yes,
here.
and I mean,
yes.
from a commercial point of view, you're a big publisher, you're a kind of a working academic, someone using very intimidating and threatening language, writes with a demand that you apologize, and then you find out more and you see, well, an apology is just words, and he's asking for some small sum of money, and life is short, and it's a distraction, and the threat is unpleasant anyway to have to live with, so give him what he wants and move on, would be the kind of standard response, and was the standard response. That, I think, was what, that I know, was what Irving was expecting.
Deborah, why didn't you settle at that point?
Because, some people had suggested I settle. That it's even if I win, I'll lose in the court of public opinion. Who'll get so much public attention, but I don't remember if Anthony said it first or I said it first. I was saying, what should I settle for? 4 million Jews? 3 million Jews? not really a mass killing, but not a genocide, one gas chamber, two camps with gas. You can't settle. I mean, there's certainly, when you do history there, people have different views, and a truth emerges, so that truth is questioned once again, and then it's revisited. But when someone says this didn't happen, the thought that I would apologize, settle, and then be able to look a Holocaust survivor or the child of a Holocaust survivor in the eye and say, well, I did it for expeditious reasons, it just didn't make sense. And I remember very clearly the phone call when Anthony and James Lipstadt, his partner, called me and said he's offering £500. And I said, but I can't settle. And they said, right.
Did you know at the time how seminal the ruling would become? And I asked that because, let's be perfectly honest, it would have been absolutely disastrous, not just for you personally, but for the Jewish community. If you had lost this case, it was a risk, wasn't it, Anthony? Or did you consider it to be open and shut at that point?
Well, two things. First of all, it was akin to arguing on Monday that it was Monday.
Yes.
So in that sense, it was not a particularly difficult case to win. Secondly, we weren't really given an alternative. I mean, or at any rate, if the alternative was saying on Monday, okay, it's Tuesday, I mean, there are lines that one's reluctant to cross for the sake of a kind of more equitable life, a life freer of conflict and risk, and that's a line that one doesn't cross, I think. So as Deborah says, in a way, all the decisions that now, in retrospect, you might think we actually made, we found made for us.
And Deborah, you wrote later a book about that pre-trial period, and then the trial itself, and it is called History on Trial: My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier. And that was actually the basis of the film, as you mentioned, Denial. You write in that book that actually having this writ and suddenly, as you say, Camilla, this possibility of risk, I understand, Anthony, your point about facts were surely going to win in this, but that, Deborah, you felt lonely, it was scary, you felt that you were one person up against this historian. How was that period before you actually got to the trial?
Before, it was very scary. It was a great concern. I mean, there was great work being done over here in London by Anthony and James and the team of people around them. But I was sort of removed from that, and even when I came and saw what was being done, it was very heartening. But still, if we lost, it would be my loss. If it didn't work, it wouldn't be because of some fluke or the judge didn't see something. And I worried about that. I worried about it a lot. Once the trial started, and once I saw the devastating, I had seen all the information, I'd seen all the reports, but how devastating it was to him. And Richard Rampton, who was our QC, who's since passed away, who was just marvelous in his soft-spoken but relentless way of holding Irving's feet to the fire, I began to relax.
Before, Anthony, we get into some of the key pieces of evidence that won it for you guys, his decision to have a judge-led and not a jury-led trial, what impact did that have?
So in those days, it was standard for there to be a jury in libel cases, and there had to be an order of the court specifically directing a judge-only trial. Our sense was that although the outcome would not have been different if there'd been a jury, the trial itself would have gone on for much longer.
Yes.
And there would have been an incentive to Irving to ham it up for the jury, which would have been tiresome to sit through. But principally, what we were interested in was a fully reasoned judgment from the trial judge, which we would only have got if the trial judge was in charge of determinations of the facts as well as of the law. That's to say, if it was a judge-only case. If we'd had a jury, then the judge's speech would have been the direction to the jury, and the jury's verdict would have been just simply finding for the plaintiff or the defendant. This way, we got a 270-page judgment from the judge, and that was the prize.
And we're going to get into that rhetoric in a moment once we've discussed the key points for your defence and how they landed. Because we have a situation here where David Irving is arguing legal points about libel in general, but also that you're having to challenge some of his claims. Some of his claims at the time included that because there wasn't documentary evidence of the camps, that we can't know that the camps existed. We have other claims associated with Adolf Hitler that no, actually, he wasn't concerned with the extermination of the Jews. He tries to absolve Adolf Hitler from vicarious responsibility by saying things like, oh no, the SS officers just sort of went off the reservation. Wasn't one of the main sort of key planks of the Third Reich and all the rest of it. So you are having to then rely on your own historians to debunk his evidence. Just talk us through some of the key moments as you remember them.
Well, I think, first of all, there is documentary evidence. And our historian on Auschwitz, Robert Jan van Pelt, who had written before on this period of history and on what we can know. He was actually an architectural historian initially, and there were the documents and there were the plans, and we juxtaposed the documents with events that were happening, and there is a very strong historical record. We didn't call survivors as witnesses, and we can get into that, but
why didn't you?
Well, for two reasons. First of all, as per Anthony and James's observations, we didn't want this to turn into a did the Holocaust happen trial. We wanted this to be, was Deborah Lipstadt telling the truth when she called him a Holocaust denier? Survivors would have been witnesses of fact. I was here, I saw this, etc. And they would have had to be witnesses who actually worked in the gas chambers and worked in the crematoria. And there were very few of those. But more importantly, we didn't want to suggest to the judge that we had to prove that the Holocaust happened. That was an outcome of the trial, but that wasn't our main objective. So that was one. Number two, that was the legal, I guess, calculation. But on a moral ground and a personal ground, we feared that David Irving putting with a Holocaust survivor in the witness box, trying to remember the most chaotic, the most horrific thing that had happened, he would humiliate them. He would grandstand. He would try to show them, find little things that they didn't know, or you say this happened on this day when we know that the gas chamber wasn't working. They didn't have wristwatches, so they didn't have clocks, they didn't have calendars, and we just decided that that was not the way we wanted to go. But more importantly, by assembling this dream team, literally, of historians, leading historians, and then following the footnotes back to the sources, looking at documents, we established a historical record that didn't exist before.
That's why the case was and is so important. In April 2000, you did win, and Mr. Justice Gray Anthony did agree that Monday was Monday.
Yes.
Thank goodness, delivering an absolutely damning verdict which found the charges against Irving substantially true. I'll just quote a little bit of what he said, but as you say, Anthony, the judgment ran to hundreds of pages. Mr. Justice Gray said, Irving has, for his own ideological reasons, persistently and deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence that for the same reasons he has portrayed Hitler in an unwarrantedly favourable light, principally in relation to his attitude towards and responsibility for the treatment of the Jews. That he, Irving, is an active Holocaust denier. That he is anti-Semitic and racist. That he associates with right-wing extremists who promote neo-Nazism. Therefore, the defence of justification succeeds.
Also, crucially, he adds, it is my conclusion that no objective, fair-minded historian would have serious cause to doubt that there were gas chambers at Auschwitz and that they were operated on a substantial scale to kill hundreds of thousands of Jews. And it follows that it is my conclusion that Irving's denials of these propositions were contrary to the evidence.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And Anthony, as you say, it was slightly Monday is Monday, but nevertheless, what was that day like when you got the judgment?
Of course, it was a great day. I mean, one can be understated about these things, and to make the point that the case could not be lost is not to make the point that there wasn't considerable celebration and a sense of triumph and vindication on the day that we actually got that.
But there was an irony to that day. The people at the law firm knew because there was a 24-hour lapse.
Yes.
And David Irving, because he was a litigant in person, because he knew as well. I was the only one out of the loop. And I suggested to James Lipstadt, I said, well, I'll call you that morning. I'll say, is it sunny over where or is it storming? And he said, and I would be disbarred or whatever the equivalent is. So I didn't know till the next morning.
And how did you feel, Deborah, given, as you say, and as you wrote about in your subsequent book, this was a tough process and period to go through, at some risk to you?
Yes, I felt overwhelmed. I mean, you can hear in my voice, I'm getting, as we say, verklempt, a little, taking back to that moment. I think I was in the cab, and we were going into court, I don't know, at 11, and they could release it at 9:30. At 9:29, I was on the phone, and Anthony said, I can't tell you for another minute. I said, by me, it's 9:30.
Yes.
And it was quite overwhelming.
I don't think we were completely sensitive in the way we should have been to the very distinct sense of isolation that you had. I think because partly we were day to day involved in the fighting of the case, the correspondence, the advocacy, the trial preparation, and all the rest of it. So we were fully immersed in it. And secondly, because this was our job, we had a very clear sense of our direction of travel and the likely outcome. Whereas you were essentially being asked to just sit quietly in a corner and let us get on with it,
right.
Which is not something that temperamentally you found very easy, which is absolutely fair. But also was a bit like the relationship perhaps between a patient and a surgeon. It's not really enough for the surgeon to say, it's fine, I've done 1,000 of these operations before. You are still the body stretched out, unconscious, on the operating table. So it's right that you should have a higher level of anxiety. And I think perhaps we weren't as sensitive as we could have been. So let me take the opportunity of this podcast to say sorry.
I've been waiting for that for 25 years.
Well, there you are. You have your scoop.
But Deborah, when you obviously get emotional, it's completely understandable.
Mm-hmm.
You're welling up there, making us feel emotional, frankly. I mean, this had been 4 years of your life, let's not forget. The original complaint is made in 96. We don't get this judgment till 2000. But when you well up thinking about it, what's going through your mind?
Well, I think first of all, the emotional, from the first moment when I got that information, I didn't know what I was going to do till Anthony came on and James and the firm took on the case. But also the survivors. We had survivors in the courtroom every single day. Mm-hmm. And they would reach out to touch you as you walked past them, because we would go in a few minutes early. And Richard Rampton is not here anymore to tell the story, but on the night of the verdict, I was in Jeremy Paxton's studio, and David Irving was in another studio across town. But Richard Rampton, I believe his wife and his family, went out to dinner with Robert Jan van Pelt, our expert on Holocaust, and a few of the others. And they were at some restaurant in Battersea, and standing on the street, Richard began to weep. Mm. So many survivors had come to thank him. And he was overwhelmed, as am I. A few weeks later, I was in Washington at the Capitol Rotunda for the Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration. And James, in fact, came to be there because we were going to do a couple of events together. And the number of survivors who come up to thank you. We fought a law case. It was a difficult case. For me, it was personally trying. But when a survivor of Auschwitz comes and says thank you, I mean, not to be verklempt would be weird.
Yes. And you say it changed your life, Deborah. In what way?
Well, it changed my whole direction of my research in terms of Holocaust denial, and from there, anti-Semitism. Certainly then the subsequent film, which brought it to millions. And then after that, I might have been appointed anyway, but nominated by President Biden, confirmed by the Senate, for an ambassadorship and the State Department's job of special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, a 3-year stint which I've just completed. So, I traveled the world, taking up this issue all over the world with different countries, and I can't tell you how many countries I got to where either the people at the American Embassy or in the foreign ministry in whatever country, oh, we watched your film last night, and then I would say, oh, you were expecting Rachel Weisz, sorry to disappoint, But it more than that. I mean, that's the sort of the fluff, the extraneous. To sit for 9 weeks, but I don't know, 10 feet. Not even yards, 10 feet, from a man who so joyfully exuded anti-Semitism and racism and misogyny and hatred of Jews and contempt for Jews. And he had his followers, his acolytes, in the gallery, and you could see it was joy for him to be doing this. To see the personal face of hatred in that way, of something you have studied for decades, to see that personal face was just overwhelming, and it gave me a sense of something that no book learning and no documents and would do, and I think in that sense it also changed my life.
As Kamal has alluded to, you've written several more books on related issues, Deborah: My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier, The Eichmann Trial, Antisemitism, Here and Now, and you've served, as you say, you've just finished that stint as the United States Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Antisemitism between 2022 and 2025. And then, Anthony, you
Yes.
also have written several books on this issue: A History of Anti-Semitism in England,
Yeah.
The Rebirth of Anti-Semitism in the 21st Century, and T.S. Eliot, Anti-Semitism and Literary Form. I know you've also worked on cases to tackle anti-Semitism and indeed campaigned against the boycott of Israeli universities, and you've been involved with the Foundation for Jewish Heritage and the Institute of Jewish Studies. But since October the 7th, we have witnessed this extraordinary resurgence, not just of anti-Semitism, and that's been verified by groups in the UK, including the CST and others. We've seen the sort of podcastization, I think, of a degree of Holocaust denial, or at least Holocaust revisionism. We have a lawyer in the studio, so we have to be careful quite what we're alleging here. But in general, what do you think we've witnessed since October the 7th, and how worried are you both by it?
Well, first of all, let's spend a moment thinking about what Holocaust denial means in the current conjuncture. So the Holocaust, the historical event, the Holocaust, is a set of facts which are available for study and examination by serious-minded historians and others, and form part of the historical record. So that's one sense of the Holocaust. There is a second sense of the Holocaust, which is as a resource for anti-Semites. And that's an overlapping set of somewhat contradictory fantasies. One fantasy is the so-called Holocaust never happened. It was invented by the Jews in order to extort money from the West, in order to establish Israel and so on. That's one fantasy. Another fantasy is, yes, it did happen, but the Jews had it coming to them. It didn't happen, and the Jews had it coming. Of course, are completely contradictory positions, but nevertheless they coexist in the kind of fantasy alternative reality of anti-Semitism. Another one is, yes, it did happen to the Jews, and now look, the Jews are doing the same to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the new Jews, the Jews are the new Nazis. So that's a kind of flipping of the Holocaust. What's consistent throughout these different uses of the historical facts of the Holocaust is a kind of malicious appropriation of those facts for the broader purpose of campaigning against Jews. So the most unpromising historical facts from the point of view of anti-Semites, have been appropriated by anti-Semites for their own purposes. It's quite extraordinary to see, but that's what's happened. Now, as if that wasn't complicated enough, you have another layer which is introduced as a result of the 7th October, and that is the murderous, lethal attacks on Jews by Hamas. In turn, part of the historical record, those attacks are being denied for, broadly speaking, the same motives. So you have an overlaying on Holocaust denial of 7th October denial, and a drawing on the same kind of nonsensical, contradictory claims. It didn't happen. On the one hand, it did happen, but it's proper resistance. The Jews had it coming. And in any event, so to speak, the Jews / the Israelis are worse. So Jews have put, as they imagined, Holocaust denial behind them, in part because of the trial perhaps, only to find that they're confronting a new form of atrocity denial, which in turn draws on a revived Holocaust denialism. I hope that's not too complicated an account, but that's where we are.
Yeah. Deborah, can you give us some sense from an American perspective on the resurgence of Holocaust denialism and anti-Semitism in general? Is October the 7th been a marker where it is seen from then a rapid increase, or has it actually been an increase that we've been seeing after what was seen as possibly a moment when it could be cut off, which was your trial?
I think the latter. There certainly was a rise before October 7th, but October 7th opened the floodgates. And we saw a resurgence, and even more disturbance than the resurgence, we've seen a normalization of anti-Semitism. And one can argue that that normalization has been there for millennia, and we just had a couple of decades after the Holocaust where we had a lull, or that it's something new and different. But certainly a normalization where people will say things that they never would have said, at least for the previous 30 or 40 years. And that is very disturbing. In terms of Holocaust denial, we have, as Anthony was saying a moment ago, this Holocaust inversion. The victim becomes the perpetrator. I mean, it was for the anti-Semite, the idea that the Jew could be the victim was just too much to bear. So this allows them to flip it. And we have the denialism. I think you can talk about denial of the atrocities of October 7th, but I want to focus on one area, the gender-based violence of October 7th. The rape, mutilation of women, mostly Israeli Jewish women, but also some Arab women who lived in that region, non-Jewish women who were at the music festival, Druze women. And then afterwards, the very groups that should have been most outspoken, the feminist groups, the human rights groups, their failure to speak out, they're saying, well, we need more evidence, we need more details. None of the victims have come forward. Most of the victims were either dead or in captivity and hostages in Gaza, and or the justification. Yes, but, yes, now when America was attacked on 9/11, no one said, well, remember the war in Afghanistan or Iraq or whichever war you want to choose that we were involved in at that point. I think when it comes to that kind of violence, but certainly gender-based violence, people should recognize, and feminist organizations and groups and individuals have been saying this, there's no but in rape.
No, I wrote a column about it, sort of hashtag Me Too,
That's right.
Except if she's a Jew.
That's right.
And it followed me going to the House of Commons and listening to testimony from those who dealt with the body and who dealt with the female bodies in the aftermath of October the 7th. Probably the most harrowing 90 minutes session in Parliament I've ever sat through in my life. And what people don't understand is that lay people are brought in to help.
That's right.
And because of the nature of being Jewish, the need for immediate burial and all the rest of it. And testimony was given in the Commons, which absolutely suggested that women there weren't only raped but also tortured before they were murdered. And I have been shocked when I've reported on some of these issues how many people so casually say on social media, there's no evidence for this.
Right.
Then we've also got the video, which many journalists watched, of the aftermath of the attacks. And as you say, we've got this kind of casualised revisionism of the Holocaust. When I talk about the podcastisation, I'm talking about the row between Douglas Murray and Joe Rogan as to some of the people that he has platformed on the show,
That's right.
including Daryl Cooper. We've also had the American influencer and some would say anti-Semite Dan Bilzerian. He was platformed by Piers Morgan. Now, on that point, the counter-narrative is, and I'd be intrigued to know what you think of it, we do need to hear from the likes of David Irving, as unpleasant as his views may be to many. We do need to hear this Holocaust denial in order to debunk it. Anthony?
Well, that's the great defence of unqualified free speech advanced by our great liberal intellectual, the 19th century John Stuart Mill, that the truth needs falsehood in order to keep it robust and vivid. And it's a powerful and important position to take. But on a day-to-day basis, making decisions, do we invite Irving to talk his nonsense on this or that occasion? I mean, these are contextual decisions that are made. I wouldn't rush to invite him to a conference on aspects of Holocaust history just to have him there as a kind of stale provocation to serious historians who can be relied upon to interrogate evidence without the assistance of a fantasist and a liar.
I would agree 100%. You could have a session at a historical conference on Holocaust deniers, what they say, and then maybe try to figure out why they say it. But you wouldn't have at a conference on earth sciences, well, let's bring in the flat earth people, and then you might have a session on why some people still believe the earth is flat, when we know it's to the contrary. But I don't think we have to give them a platform. I don't think in a conference on racism and the fight for racial equality, we have to give white supremacists the platform. I think that's fuzzy thinking. We have to address it. We have to look at it. We have to understand how we might respond. But I don't think it's necessary. That doesn't mean you don't give them, if they want to go to Hyde Park Corner and get a soapbox and stand on it, it's their freedom to do that, or in Times Square or in New York and any place else. But we don't have to provide that platform.
How much, Deborah, and particularly given your work in the US as this special envoy for monitoring and, slightly more positive word, combating anti-Semitism, how much is social media, podcasting, as you say, Camilla, the internet and digital distribution, a platform for this tide that is almost impossible to control?
It's a tremendous platform. There's a delivery system today. The anti-Semitism may be the same, but there's a delivery system today that didn't exist before. And what is it? A lie goes around the world before truth has a chance to put its pants on. And now it's in a nanosecond. So it is not to say that I don't use social media, not to say that I don't use it as a reference point and checking things out. Of course we do. But it's like a knife. A knife in the hands of a killer can take a life. A knife in the hands of a surgeon can save a life. It's how we use it. And this calls not for government regulation, but for the public at large. They have this unbelievable tool in their hands. How you use it, critical thinking, how you understand what you're seeing. It puts, because we've been given this, if you want to call it, gift of the internet and gift of social media, there's a tremendous responsibility on us for how we use it.
How worried are you about the sort of distance now between the testimonies, the first-hand testimonies of some of the survivors. Funny enough, after this, I'm going to go up to Cockfosters in North London and interview a veteran for our VE Day coverage who was involved in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, actually a Jewish soldier who moved to the UK and ended up fighting for the Allied forces. But, you know, a lot of survivors now have sadly passed away. Do you think enough younger people, I would include Jews, but also Gentiles in that, are spending enough time campaigning to make sure people remember the Holocaust? This must continue, you know, but we're going to get into a period where, unfortunately, young people won't be able to reference their grandparents and their great-grandparents. And it's difficult then, isn't it, Anthony, to sort of make sure that people understand exactly what happened in this, as I described at the beginning, probably the most heinous period of the 20th century.
It's difficult and it's not difficult.
Okay.
So it's difficult for the reasons that you've given, but it's also not difficult because all the resources exist, including film testimony and indeed even holographic representations of these past survivors. So if anyone wants to find out the truth, it's readily available. The more fundamental problem is a lack of interest in the truth, and that goes to much deeper questions that don't just concern Jews and Holocaust denial, but the forms of political education or miseducation that are troubling us now, generally.
And Anthony, we want to, as we come towards the end of this fantastic conversation, we do want some optimism and some hope. I mean, Anthony, how would you go about tackling this issue that you raised, Camilla, about, particularly for younger generations? It's clear that their knowledge is becoming more and more thin on what happened in the 20th century and the horrors of the Holocaust. Yes, the resources are there, but they've been there for a long time.
Yes.
What else should be happening? We have seen, you know, I have Jewish friends who say that they feel unsafe travelling in London because of the endless repetitive protests of people who are claiming that they are somehow there to defend the rights of Palestinians. I was astonished. As I say, I'm obviously not Jewish. I'm Muslim heritage. But for a friend to say that to me in this great city that I call home, I found absolutely remarkable. It seems that we're going the wrong way.
Yes, it is true that there are Jews, many Jews, who feel intimidated by the protests and are unable to go to the synagogues because the protests are on Saturdays and very clearly and deliberately are staged near the synagogues with a view to creating an intimidating atmosphere. And it's partly a problem of policing, and it's partly, again, a bigger question of what's considered acceptable, at any rate when it's directed at Jews. And these are serious and difficult problems, and I don't have any hopeful or optimistic messages on that front.
Deborah, be optimistic for us.
Well, I will be, but first, it's real.
Yeah.
Students at universities in the UK, in France, and Germany, and the United States, who are in the dormitories and don't put a mezuzah on their door or put it inside because they don't want students knocking on their door and yelling anti-Semitic things. Young people who, I was talking to a 12-year-old last week who wears a Jewish star, but she puts it under her shirt, not over her shirt. I mean, it's impacting people in a very real way. You might say, okay, so she wears it under her shirt. What's the big deal? Well, she's 12. She knows enough to be free. On an optimistic note, I was interviewed. It was actually here in the UK. Was it Hay on Wye on Hay?
Yes, the Hay Festival.
The Hay Festival,
Hay
right. And a former editor of one of your newspapers was interviewing me, and she asked me the same question. There were about 400 people there. And I had come from Bath. I'd been in Bath over the weekend, and I went to the National Trust, of the site. And it's like going to an ancient spa. You know, there's a hot bath and a cold bath and a massage room and all that. And I said, I could have gotten into this. And then you get to the part where there's the remnants of the temple because the Romans thought that hot baths must be a gift of the gods. And I said, that would have been difficult if I was a Jew because to come to this place. And I thought about the longevity of anti-Semitism, and certainly in the UK, it's got a long history, well beyond Bath. And I said to her, but we're still here. As a historian, I can give you no logical explanation for why Jews are still here, in many ways thriving, living good lives, and fighting this pernicious and persistent hatred. So if we've lasted all these years, there must be a good reason, and so I'm optimistic.
I think we should end on that very optimistic note. Deborah Lipstadt and Anthony Julius, thank you very much indeed for coming into the Daily Tea today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
for inviting
Thank you.
Thank you.